All right, without further delay, let's talk about the chapter in your textbook is referred to as the IRA era. And the IRA is not, in this case, individual retirement accounts or the Irish Republican Army. It is referring to the Indian Reorganization Act, which was the Indian Reorganization Act was the law passed in 1934 during the sort of the early years of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and basically during the first year of the New Deal. Roosevelt gets elected in 1932, right? Takes office in 1933, but it took a while before Congress would accept a lot of the New Deal plan that he and his folks. The New Deal itself, much broader thing, very, very ambitious, very, very different from what had been the norm in the United States for a long time. So it was difficult to get it all passed. So 1934 is kind of when things get implemented. Now, up to this point, you've read about allotment, and you can't overemphasize allotment when it comes to American Indian law and policy. It's still with us in many ways. But by 1924, during the the 50 years before 1924, the United States underwent a great acceleration in foreign immigration, and the massive amounts of immigration that took place during that period. Some of it had actually begun in the middle 19th century with the arrival of the Irish in the 1840s. The Irish potato famine sent lots and lots of non-English folks to America, and they were distinctive in that they were Roman Catholic, and they were the American populace, sort of didn't accept them very well in the 1840s. So the Irish eventually, made their way in. At the same time, in the 1840s, 1850s, you have a lot of people coming from the German-speaking lands of Central Europe. So, and then after the Civil War, lands were opened up in the Great Plains, and you have a lot of immigration of people from still the British Isles, but also Germany and also Scandinavia. And those immigrants are generally referred to as the old immigrants. Okay, the old immigrants were the ones who were from northwestern Europe, essentially. Northwestern Europe didn't have a lot of big differences culturally with Anglo-America. The majority of people were Protestants. If they weren't, there were some Catholics and from Germany and of course the Irish, but there were also a lot of Lutherans and a lot of other Reformed churches. So those were Protestants, and they also learned English rather quickly, especially the Scandinavians. So they fit in pretty quickly. So that's why they call them the old immigrants. The new immigrants began to arrive mostly around 1880, and then their immigration would continue until it was basically capped by the United States government. And those were folks mainly from Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, okay? And they were relatively different. Italians and Southern Europeans included, both Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christianity. Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans didn't assimilate quite as quick as those Northwest Europeans. So that's why they're often referred to as the old immigrants, but the new immigrants. The new immigrants tended to cluster in cities and tended to not necessarily move out into the countryside as much. Now, during this period, in the beginning of the 1920s, the United States passed prohibition, created an amendment to create prohibition in 1919, and that helped grow organized crime. All right, so the 1920s were considered, the Roaring Twenties. They were times of great social change. They were also a time of lots of the growth of organized crime, and they were also a time of the expansion of the federal government into criminal law. The FBI really kind of takes off during this time, in the 1930s especially, with J. Edgar Hoover. And the growth of the federal judiciary and the federal law enforcement agencies, various agencies, eventually, culminating in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Federal Bureau of Intimidation, which it was for a long time, until the 70s and 80s, actually. Anyway, the federal judiciary, of course, tended to target certain groups, and by the late 1940s, as the Cold War gets started, we begin to see the term subversives and all this. But before all that, in the 1920s, there was a lot of angst among people in government toward the continuing rise of immigrants from Eastern Europe, particularly. And Eastern Europe was, of course, between 1917 and 1924, included Russia, and Russia had been experiencing its revolution, its communist revolution. So there was a lot of angst about, are these Eastern Europeans, especially Jews, coming from Russia and Eastern Europe, who tended to favor very different sort of government, or very different, more liberal ideas. Liberal in the sense that we usually use it today, sort of left of center. So the United States began a series of immigration reforms, and it's all kind of culminated in 1924 when it stopped just the free flow of immigrants into the United States. So basically, it created quotas, so certain countries we could only receive a certain proportion or certain number of immigrants from certain countries. It discriminated against people who didn't have educations and people from Northwestern Europe, where pretty much still had the free open door to them. So in 1924, which the same year of these immigration restrictions, it was appropriate for Congress to also revisit this idea of Native Americans being United States citizens. Up to this point, there were about 2/3 of American Indians. Suppose this is an estimate, of course. About 2/3 of the population of Native Americans were already citizens, mostly through allotment. The allotment process created, if you took your allotment, then it wound up becoming a United States citizen. So about 1/3 didn't know, and a lot of those, of course, were on restricted allotments. So these were people who, many of them, were living in rural areas, had been subjected to allotment, but yet were not United States citizens. So 1924, all Native American people were declared United States citizens. Now you might think, well, yippee, that's great. Well, it didn't give Native Americans all of the rights and securities necessarily of United States citizens, and the courts would make that obvious, mostly in the 1950s. So we'll see that in what we call the termination era. So I'm going to move on. I'm kind of lingering too long, and I've got a lot of ugly notes that I've scribbled here. But in 1928, there began to be, in the 1920s, there began to be a sort of a questioning of the whole allotment program, the whole Indian office. Part of the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior has an enormous amount of different agencies and bureaus. But anyway, the Brookings Institution, which was a left-of-center think tank and still exists today, it's very well respected today, began a study in the 1920s. I think they actually began in around 1925, or at least the idea came about. And what they did, the Brookings Institution asked academics, scholars, mostly anthropologists, ethnologists, historians, sociologists. So social scientists, okay? And social sciences the social sciences in general were just kind of getting their sea legs at this period in the 1920s. They were just kind of emerging as sort of legitimate, not anthropology, not archaeology. It had been around a little while. But geography had been around a while. But geography had this problem called environmental determinism that it was trying to shake, right? So, Mackenzie, you've obviously had history and philosophy of geography or something like that, so you know about all this. So that's great. Carl Sauer was taking an axe to environmental determinism in the 1920s, which was good. So anyway, the social sciences were new, and the Brookings Institution employed these social scientists to basically go do field work. So and then, of course, the distribution of American Indians in the United States is very uneven. So most of these scholars were people who were kind of local to the Native American population, and in Oklahoma, the scholar who was sort of identified as the person to go out among Oklahoma Native peoples was a historian down at the University of Oklahoma by the name of Edward Everett Dale. Okay, E.E. Dale. He became a pretty famous historian in Oklahoma, mostly a Western history guy, but he was part of this group who also included some other scholars that you would identify probably depending on your field. But one of the individuals who was selected was a man by the name of Collier, John Collier. And John Collier was a sociologist. I'm going to talk a little bit about John Collier personally. I don't really have it on the slides, I don't think. But Collier was actually born into some wealth in Atlanta, Georgia. So he was originally from Atlanta, and I believe his father was a judge or something like that. But anyway, he was kind of coming from old money. But yet he was a person who, he was probably kind of a rebel, I suppose. He didn't identify with the upper class that he was born into, and began to study sociology. And he actually went to France, to Paris, and studied in Paris for a while. And during the 19-teens and 20s, early 20s, Paris was like a real hotbed of socialism and, talk of communism. And so he came back and became a lawyer. So he had a a really good background in sociology, and then he also wound up becoming he started something known as the Native American Legal Defense Fund, or Native American Defense Fund, or American Indian Defense Fund. So we'll see that in a second. Anyway, so Collier is one of these people on this field project done by the Brookings Institution, and the study, or the project, was culminated in a book that was published by the Brookings Institution in 1928, called "The Problem of Indian Administration," and it became popularly known as the Merriam Report, because I think it's Lewis Merriam was the principal author, but lots of people contributed to it. It's a very big book. Anybody ever heard of that? Problem of Indian Administration, or the Merriam Reports. This was the first it was a project done to study the situation of American Indian people in the United States in the 1920s, mid-1920s. And it was, it used private monies to do this. So this, we would call the Brookings Institution today and then an NGO, a non-government organization. So it's a non-government group studying this. So they came out with an enormous amount of criticism for the federal government. Here's a little bit more detail, I guess. 1923 is when Collier formed the American Indian Defense Association. Sorry, I just quoted it. I think it would change names later. And the American Indian Defense Association was a lobbyist group that was against all of the federal policies to that point, which were associated with assimilation, beginning with the peace policy project, like the Indian boarding schools, the integration of religious groups into American Indian Agency and the United States Indian Service. It countered those assimilationist policies, including allotment, and it identified, because of the study, the problems that allotment had created already. The federal government had been since the peace policy, had been in the business of attempting to eliminate American Indian spiritual beliefs, American Indian religion, and replacing them with Protestantism. And in a lot of cases, the federal government was like 100% successful, all right, of eliminating traditional religious practices, particularly in Oklahoma, all right. So what the American Indian Defense Association attempted to do early on was challenge all of these federally supported projects, and that had basically placed tribal religion on the chopping block and attempted to eliminate it. Boarding schools were a big part of that. Having religious groups, working in the Indian office was another one. So Collier was, from pretty early on, an activist against the federal government, and especially against the Indian office. You like him so far, don't you? Okay. So anyway, he was, I need to find out. I'd like to see if there's any papers written on J. Edgar Hoover and John Collier. Boy, that would be like matter, antimatter. That would be really interesting. I don't know if one exists. All right, now this other note down below refers to Harold Ickes. All right, and Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior, the head of the Department of the Interior, appointed by FDR. And Ickes had been introduced to Collier, couldn't stand him, nevertheless, they wanted to shake things up in the Indian office. So, kind of like when Trump, you remember, I don't know if you all were old enough, but when President Trump entered office, the Environmental Protection Agency was, run by, the Secretary of the Interior and the head of the agencies like, the EPA, are usually political appointees, but they're employed. Everybody else is a professional, who is there for a career, and they don't get fired when the presidential administration changes. But the secretaries do, and and the undersecretaries, I guess, whatever. But when Trump entered office, who did he name as head of the EPA? Do you remember?
Attorney General of Oklahoma.
Yeah, he was the Attorney General of Oklahoma. You remember what his name was? Scott Pruitt. Okay, Scott Pruitt was enemy number one of the EPA. He had sued the EPA on the part of the state of Oklahoma 7 times. Okay, so he knew all of its weaknesses, and that's why Trump appointed him head of the EPA, to shake things up, right? So and so this is what Ickes did with John Collier. Everybody in the Indian office had the same mindset, and he goes, okay, well, we'll put the biggest enemy that the Indian office has, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in charge of the place and see what happens. So that's what happened. So up to that point, Collier had really started his whole career demonizing the Office of Indian Affairs, and it's assimilationist NGOs, an NGO, non-government organization. So there were assimilationist NGOs, just like there was the American Indian Defense Association, which was a pro-culture NGO. And here are a couple of important ones. The YWCA Indian Department. That was one. And then the one that fascinates me, the one that was probably had the loudest mouth, was the Indian Rights Association. Now that sounds innocuous. I mean, it sounds, like that's, probably a pro-native, pro-tribalism group, but it wasn't. This is the group that was really adamantly against or for assimilation. This is the group that was the kill the Indian, save the man group. All right. So anyway, Collier had been going after those people for a long time. Here's John Collier. He was known to not really have much of a sense of humor. He looked pretty serious there. But he was I say CIA, that's the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. That's the head of the Office of Indian Affairs, or VIA. So Ickes appointed Collier to be the commissioner, and I've told you a little bit about what he was all about. Now, how did Collier, I didn't mention how Collier came to be a pro-traditionalism and very much pro-Native American crusader. He had spent a year in Taos, New Mexico. Okay, Taos was a really interesting place, still is, but it was really interesting around the turn of the century. There were a lot of artists there. It was becoming this art colony, and he went and lived with a wealthy woman, benefactor, who pretty much introduced him to the Pueblo culture, and he was accepted into the local Taos Pueblo as a friend, and learned to really respect and appreciate the Taos Pueblo traditions, and he also saw how they were being attacked. So he found, as a sociologist, he really believed that American society could really benefit from understanding American Indian cultures. American society, in his view, was, in the 19 teens and 20s, incredibly materialistic, you know, and all about you know, getting ahead materially at the expense of family, at the expense of community, and so he really honestly believed that if non-Indian Americans would understand American Indian cultures better, it would be beneficial to them. And so anyway, so he's appointed commissioner in 1933, but he was able to get this huge piece of legislation called the Indian Reorganization Act, it's actually called the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934, passed by Congress. Now, like I said, Congress was not really open to a lot of these big changes. A lot of the New Deal programs were altered before they were ratified, before they could pass both houses of Congress. But the Indian Reorganization Act did a number of things. So, you know, what Collier wanted to do was completely reverse assimilation, not just stop it, but reverse it. So that would mean closing religious boarding schools, stopping the loss of tribal lands through allotment, and in some cases, reinstating tribal government that had been obliterated by whatever had obliterated it. So I've got more notes here. These notes just say that, you know, Collier was a revolutionary zealot. He was a crusader. I'll put it that way. He wanted to basically take the BIA off of the tribes back, get them out of the tribes' business. But he also had kind of this romantic, you know, non-native romantic vision of tribalism. I think that's pretty clear that, you know, he didn't see any wrong in any Native American traditions, whatever. Not that, you know, you should, but anyway. So he was considered at the time a real radical, with one of the more radical people within the Radical New Deal. Right? And like this note says, only some of his ideas were actually enacted in the Indian Reorganization Act. And some of them were altered by Congress with mistakes, as we'll see. There was a mistake made in the Indian constitutional program. Don't worry about it. You'll see all this online, so you don't really need to kill yourself taking notes. So here's some basics of the Wheeler-Howard Act, or the Indian Reorganization Act. I don't know why we give everything 2 or 3 names, but this is it. It was the first time that government treated tribes with any real respect, or even that they should continue to exist into the future. All right, this is a major change, 180-degree change, right? So up until this time, and particularly after the Indian Removal Act, right, and especially after the Indian Wars of the 1870s and the peace policy that got started after the Civil War, the government begins to actually respect Native American groups as legitimate groups of people in the country. It established these major protections. Number 1, the IRA ended allotment. Yes?
I still can't understand how we went from, the government just changing policies, almost immediately because of a single person.
Well, it was part of the New Deal, and the New Deal was radical. It was, and it was intentionally like this because in 1929 the stock market crashed. By 1931, we were in a Great Depression. Right, so the Depression really caused most Americans to kind of rethink everything. Maybe we're on the wrong track. Not everybody, but enough to get FDR elected, and so FDR brought in, he brought in people like Ickes, and Ickes was there to shake things up. So this is one of the examples. I'm fascinated by the New Deal. Myself, it's not because I necessarily agree with its policies, but it was a serious change in the pathway of American development of the country, and not everything worked, but it's amazing to think that. Well, the Merriam Report was kind of the transition. That's kind of why I started this discussion. The Merriam Report was came out in the 1920s. So there was, after World War I, some beginnings of, rumbling about, is all of this government stuff even working? So, but yeah, it is a major, major change. And that goes to, that points at one of the things that I've mentioned early in this course, and that is the so-called pendulum of American Indian policy or American Indian law, United States Indian policy. And this was definitely a big turnaround from, let's say, 1914, prior to World War I, and the Great Depression. This is a big change. But it was quick, but it wasn't necessarily overnight. But good question. The IRA also extended the trust period indefinitely on parcels that remained restricted. And I remember one response I don't know whose it was, because when I'm grading the exams, I turned off the names and it's all jumbled, so I don't know whose answers is what, so I don't know who wrote this, and I don't want you to say if it's yours. But somebody mentioned the New Deal, I think, on an exam question, and what happened here? Oh, it was the question about fractionation. You remember that one? And whoever that was, I made a note in the comments that the New Deal actually sort of made the fractionation issue permanent, because the government extended the trust period on restricted allotments indefinitely. That meant that this kind of was the point of no return for fractionation, unless the individuals who owned it were able to, petition the Secretary of the Interior and have the restrictions removed. But overall, Collier's plan was to stop this problem of allotment. There were still allotments being made. It also directed the Department of the Interior to restore remaining surplus lands to tribal ownership. That was good, so that the reservations that were that had not yet sold off their surplus lands or given away their surplus lands from allotment, those were sort of frozen so that they would not be removed. And then it also authorized, another part of this, let's see here. Another part of that I don't mention here, but I'll probably mention later. I've got tons of notes here for you to look at. But, in addition to stopping the sale of surplus lands, it also allowed for new reservations to be created and existing reservations to be added to. So here we go from trying to get rid of all the Indian trust land to actually making a way for more Indian trust land to come about, and tribal trust land, Indian title. And this one, number 5, was one that Collier was really excited about. It was a plan that within the law, tribes would be authorized to adopt constitutions and ratify them by council votes in order to basically revive a form of tribal government. And I think Collier, I haven't done a biography, or I'd like to read a biography of him, but Collier had kind of the idea that Native Americans ought to have their own governments like states, perhaps even maybe an amendment to the Constitution or something. But he believed that they needed to have some help sort of formalizing their government structure so that they would be able to survive into the future. Also, the boarding schools were closed. They were done away with, except for some that, and these were the religious boarding schools primarily. The secular boarding schools would continue. And not all boarding schools were necessarily horrible places, but the ones that he was particularly concerned about were the boarding schools and that used the Indian the rules that were created by the Indian office to punish children for speaking their language, and Indian courts of offenses, I believe is what it's called. But anyway, it was an administrative rule thing. You've read about it in this chapter if you've read this chapter. Oklahoma tribes were not included in the Indian Reorganization Act. They were specifically excluded. And the idea was that Oklahoma was a special case because the federal government had become involved in the affairs of the native peoples of Oklahoma prior to Oklahoma statehood, unlike most other tribal groups. So it was assumed that the reservations that had existed within Oklahoma had all been disestablished. Disestablishment is a modern day term. They didn't even have it back then in the 30s. But the assumption was all the reservations had been formally removed and obliterated. Okay? Keep that in mind. Now, I mentioned there was a mistake in the Indian Reorganization Act, and you get an example. Is there an excerpt in your textbook of the Indian IRA? I think just a short one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not everything. It's a pretty long deal. But Section 18 and Section 19, I want to point out. Section 18 was the one that supposedly had a mistake. So the idea was that tribes would have their own constitutions, but apparently it was rewritten in committee or something, and they sort of perverted it in some ways. It was the way Collier had it. Supposedly, it was meant only for the consideration of constitutions. But this made the idea of constitutions. It was made part of the entire law. If that makes any sense. So basically, it was throwing this at every tribe, okay? And that was not what Collier really intended. And what it did was it required a majority vote by all the adult tribal members to take advantage of adopting a constitution. It was later corrected in the 1980s. So, but anyway, Section 18 was, and this note is about the mistake. That was William C. Canby's note. The senior judge in Arizona. Section 19 gave a comprehensive definition of Indian, which is kind of interesting. Reservations were defined later in 1948, but essentially tribal membership requirements would be established by the tribes. So that's a good one. Section 19 made it clear that tribal membership would be something that the tribes themselves would determine. Okay, now how was the Indian Reorganization Act received by Native Americans? Which is a really interesting thing. How did it play out? Well, first of all, the the way this would work was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs sent out a team. It sent out several teams to go visit tribal groups wherever, throughout the country, and they were basically doing a dog and pony show to try to sell the tribe on this program, and particularly the program of writing up constitutions and adopting those constitutions. And this is the way it worked. Dog and pony shows generally don't impress Native American people very much. So basically what happened was, out of all of the tribes, and I'm giving you numbers of population numbers rather than tribes, but of the people who participated in this, who actually showed up, close to 130,000 Native people bought into this program. But you can see more than half of that number refused it. But then again, more than half of that number who refused it were the Navajo Nation. And this is the relative, the estimated population of the Navajos in the 1930s. So, and they still don't have a constitution, and they're just doing fine. So anyway, this is John Collier, the great crusader. I think he's a superhero for Native American people, and he goes out and he really kind of gets shot down. It's kind of like, well, I assumed everybody would love this, and not necessarily. Why didn't they like this idea? Well, there are a lot of good reasons. The Indian Reorganization Act, like I said, kind of threw this idea of writing up constitutions and everything on Native peoples. It didn't, like it was intended, just make it an option. Another part of the IRA was for tribes to establish sort of corporation organization, like business organizations. So they would be chartered as corporate entities so that they could basically own property, right, as a corporate entity. So, and I've got a better set of notes here, but basically a lot of tribes didn't like the idea of new constitutions because the whole idea of having a constitution and the other thing was it was supposed to be voted on, and then it had to be, if it was going to be passed, it had to be passed by a majority of the tribe. Well, Native peoples aren't necessarily Democrats, or at least democracies are not necessarily what they think is right, or not they're necessarily their way. Rather than a popular vote, they might want to defer to elders, right? And another thing, well, what are some other reasons you might be able to guess? Now, I'm assuming you probably haven't read this chapter yet. What are some other possible reasons why Native American tribes might have said, thanks but no thanks? And just to reiterate, the IRA had a provision that said Native people, or the tribes would be able to, now don't look it up, don't go to Wikipedia, just think. Tell me, what do you suppose, why would Native peoples not buy into this idea?
I feel like there would be a lack of trust between the tribes and the federal government, because if the tribes have lived a certain way for a really long time, and then the federal government, who's done a lot of harm to them over the past several decades or century even, and the federal government comes in and says, all right, you should run your government like we run our government. They might not agree with that because they're like, no, you guys are bad.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? It's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden you're our friends, right? So we're going to trust you? We're going to trust the federal government? No way. That's a great one. Absolutely, yeah.
I can imagine that because the federal government kind of went back on all the treaties that they made in the past,
Yeah, the federal government is not to be trusted.
Yeah.
Yeah, Congress is not to be trusted.
A constitution just is to them another form of treaty that could just easily
Another-
take them back.
Yeah, another way to lock them into something. Exactly. So those were all major reasons, okay? Just what you said. And many of them already had functioning governments. They didn't need a constitution. It's not like it's sort of like the government coming and saying, we're going to fix you. But they're saying, well, we're not broken. We don't need a fix. So, all right, so a lot of tribes didn't like the idea of even getting a new constitution. They didn't necessarily want representative government. And many of them didn't want majority rule. And they certainly didn't want an adversarial relationship or an adversarial politics being created within their tribe. Consensus is frequently a way of doing things, and always has been. The idea that, okay, if you have two competing ideas and you got to select one, what you do is you hash it out and try to sell the other side. And eventually there may be people that just can't accept it, but in most of the time, those people would just kind of go silent or they wouldn't participate anymore. So consensus government was more familiar than an adversarial, us versus them thing. I mentioned that the Oklahoma tribes were not included, but in 1936, another bill was proposed to include the special provisions for Oklahoma tribes. And this became known popularly as the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. And that's basically the Oklahoma version of the Indian Reorganization Act. Okay, so Oklahoma tribes are subject to this one still today rather than the Indian Reorganization Act. But pretty much it was a carbon copy with some specific changes for Oklahoma tribes. And I want to make this point that, at least at this time, it was assumed that Oklahoma reservations had been disestablished. Because here, I wrote this before 2020, most Oklahoma reservations had been extinguished, so IRA did not apply to them. Okay, at least that's what I thought before 2020. And that's what most people assumed. Okay, so, but now we're saying they weren't. All right, now, this is a lot of sort of repetition, but some tribes did take the opportunity to sort of restructure their tribal government. And they typically mirrored state governments or the federal government by establishing a tribal council. Sometimes that was a bicameral tribal council. And then there was, a chief or sort of an executive branch, right? So like the Cherokee Nation has a principal chief. How about the Choctaw Nation? What do they call him? The executive. Anybody know? You know who the Choctaw chief executive is? Bill Anatubby? So what do they call him, do you know? They refer to him as governor.
Well, yeah, do they refer to the Choctaws like that?
I'm saying Choctaw. I meant Chickasaw.
Chickasaw, yeah, it's government.
I'm sorry, Chickasaw.
I was like, oh.
But they were one tribe at one, or at least one entity at one time, and then they broke away in 1857, or 1854 or something like that. So, sorry, Chickasaw. So Bill Anatubby is Governor Anatubby. And it's funny, when you're talking to Chickasaw people about, their government, they'll refer to the governor, the governor's office. Governor's office called, I have a friend who works in Oklahoma City for the Chickasaw Nation. They have it's basically like a business PR thing. And, she'll say, well, the governor called. This is big stuff. The big governor called. And I said, Governor Stitt? I didn't think y'all liked him. No. The governor, Bill Anatubby.
Our governor's more important
The governor, yeah. He's the highest paid executive in the state of Oklahoma, supposedly. Well, also longest serving, but he does a really good job. So, anyway, so the executive branch, and they have a judiciary. Okay, so this is the big one. We're going to be talking a lot about these. Okay, so tribal court systems, and of course, all the tribal governments in the state now not only have court systems and judges, but they also have police forces. Chickasaws call it light horse. Yeah, Cherokees are light horse, you know that, which is kind of like a sheriff's department or sheriff's office, I suppose, something like that. Okay, so and if it weren't for like the Chickasaw and the Choctaw light horses or police forces teaming up with county sheriff's offices in the state of in southeastern Oklahoma, there would be a lot less law enforcement in southeastern Oklahoma, because the Chickasaws have largely replaced, the fact that there aren't enough people in these county sheriff's offices to cover the county. If you're in rural southeast Oklahoma, you don't have most of the time a police department to call. You have a sheriff's office, but these counties are huge, and so they have state tribal compacts to allow cross deputization. So we'll talk about that another time. But it's all geographical. So anyway, tribal law has evolved since the 1930s. Tribal councils usually create these committees and subcommittees, and they pass statute laws. They pass there are tribal judicial rulings. So there's tribal law now within Indian country. So we can move on, I think, now.